Hello. Today I want to talk about the early printing regimes in Holland and England and the development of the Habermasian public sphere during the 17th and early 18th centuries. In an earlier video on the early impact of European print culture, I described some of the features of the development of European print culture in the early modern period and its initial social impact. I have also put up a video on Jurgen Habermas and the public sphere for those of you not familiar with the concept. I will put the links below this video. As I noted in the earlier video on European print culture, whilst mass printing spread rapidly across Catholic Europe in the late 15th century, marked differences later emerged between different states with regard to the control of printing, a division developing between those countries in which authors were relatively free to publish what they wanted and those in which they were not, and in which printing was tightly controlled, and the mere possession of a banned book might lead to severe punishments, even at the most extreme, to execution. Jurgen Habermas's concept of the public sphere is highly relevant here. For Habermas, when public spheres developed, it became possible, or even normal, for ordinary people who were not members of the governing elite to openly discuss matters of public policy and concern. In these terms, relatively free printing regimes facilitated the development of such public spheres, whereas restrictive ones did not. Notably, the three countries with the freest publishing regimes, initially and briefly the Venetian Republic, later the Dutch Republic, and then England, were also the main centres of the developing capitalist world economy, a correlation which strongly supports Habermas's notion of a link between capitalism and the developing public sphere. Of these three printing centres, Venice had become the major printing centre for the whole continent during the late 15th century, and by 1500 was home to some 150 printing presses, which between them had produced more than 4,000 editions, and perhaps 1/7 of all the books that had then been printed in Europe up to that date. Printing in Venice soon came under the control and restriction of the Inquisition, however, but Protestant Holland and England took a different trajectory, and it was in these two countries that printing contributed most decisively to the early emergence of a Habermasian public sphere. Accordingly, the printing regimes of these two countries will be the subject of this video. First, let me talk about the printing regime in Holland. Already by the early 17th century, controls on publishing in Holland were often ineffective and comparatively light. Books were sometimes banned and printed materials destroyed, and printers were sometimes fined and even imprisoned, but the complex federal structure of the Republic meant that the banning of a work in one town did not prevent its publication elsewhere. Again, the religious and political divides between the literary partisans of different groups of Calvinists and between the supporters and opponents of the Princes of Orange meant that there was often a plethora of mutually contradictory published voices, and hardly ever a united official voice on matters of thought. Amsterdam in particular became home to those willing to publish challenging and unconventional material, and a large number of competing print shops made it easier to find a publisher. By 1675, it was home to over half the Republic's 203 printing presses, and there were at least 230 booksellers and printers doing business in the city between 1680 and 1710. With more controversial works, most famously perhaps the works of the philosopher Spinoza, it was also possible to publish without a printer's name. Amsterdam also became a centre for printing in French by émigré French Protestants, the Huguenots, a sign of the continued internationality of printing, and a means by which French books could be published free from France's more rigorous censorship and then smuggled across the borders into France. As for England, the 13th century edict, the Scandalis Magnatum, had prohibited the dissemination of false news or opinions that might cause the growth of discord between the king and the people, and those accused could be tried and punished without warrant or normal legal process. This law was applied to printed material after the introduction of printing in 1476, and by 1585 anyone who wanted to print a book was required to obtain a license. A further licensing act in 1637 limited the number of printers, thereby ensuring that only government-approved printers could produce books or other printed material. Punishment for publishing material that was deemed critical of those in power could be severe, as in the case of the radical Puritan writer William Prynne in 1637, who was eventually sentenced to a massive fine, imprisonment, and mutilation. Parts of his ears were cut off, and he was branded on the cheeks with the letters S and L, signifying seditious libeller. The situation of publishing changed dramatically during the period of the Civil War and Interregnum, that is, from 1642 to 1660. Initially, the contestation for power led the partisans of rival political and religious factions to engage in a massive war of pamphlets to promote their respective positions. The period also saw the publication of several major controversial books, notably John Milton's Areopagitica, in which he attacked the pre-publication censorship of printed material in general as tyrannical, and Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan with its secular political philosophy. The restoration of the monarchy under Charles II in 1660 led to the reintroduction of controls on publishing, but the establishment of constitutional monarchy under William and Mary in the Glorious Revolution, so-called, of 1688-89, and the passing of the Bill of Rights in 1689 marked the commencement of a more liberal era, and the lapsing of the English licensing laws in 1695 signalled the beginning of what proved to be a revolution in English publishing. After 1688, large numbers of new books, pamphlets, newspapers, and periodicals streamed off the presses, even by the earliest decades of the 18th century, and by 1800, in excess of 300,000 book and pamphlet titles had been published in Britain, amounting perhaps to 200 million copies. I hope to be able to talk more about this in other videos, but there are obvious interactive links between the growth and liberalization of the English printing regime and the complex series of political movements in the English-speaking world, all the way through from the 17th century to the 19th. During the 17th century, these included the intense political debates of the Civil War period, the political tensions of the Restoration period, and the Glorious Revolution of 1688-89. Every aspect of these political developments and disputes was reflected in, and often aided by, print media, the most important of which, in terms of general impact, were generally pamphlets, as well as prints, the latter giving rise to political cartoons, a genre which later flourished in the 18th century. Several major books were also influential, including the works by Milton and Hobbes mentioned above. Other major works included John Locke's two treatises of government in 1689, written at an earlier date but published just after the Glorious Revolution, for which it seemed to offer legitimacy, and later taken up as a justificatory text by the American patriots in what eventually became their war for independence. In both Holland and England, then, printing contributed to the early emergence of a Habermasian public sphere and served to differentiate them from most of the rest of Europe. Despite major differences between the two states, the end results were similar: a grudging acceptance of religious diversity and a comparatively free printing regime. In both countries, other factors besides the expansion of printing were involved in the development of the public sphere. These included ongoing religious and political divisions and debates, with divisions within influential elites being particularly important. Thus, internal religious and political divisions persisted, leading to recurrent public debates and the circulation of contentious pamphlets and books supporting one faction or another. The development of forms of representative government, the decentralized nature of much of Dutch decision-making, and the inability of English governments to impose lasting controls on the printing industry. Also of major importance in England after the Civil War was the rapid spread of coffeehouses, particularly in London, where there were over 500 recognised coffeehouses by the 1730s, more than any other European city apart from Istanbul. Significantly, whilst the government of Charles II identified coffeehouses as subversive institutions, in which free political debate and discussion might occur, it failed to have them closed down in the face of popular opposition. For more details, see my video on London coffeehouses and Habermas's public sphere. Finally, let me say a few words about the often neglected topic of the large French Protestant minority, the Calvinist Huguenots. Initially in contention for power in the French state, and later a severely persecuted group, many of whose members fled their country for their lives, the Huguenots developed an early love for religious freedom and an antipathy towards state absolutism, which was eloquently expressed by some of their authors and came to have a major influence on the development of European political thought. Unsurprisingly, Holland and England became two of the most common refuges for Huguenot exiles. Thank you for listening.